Gavin Newsom entered the Senate hearing room resembling an individual auditioning for the nation's highest office. JD Vance interacted with him accordingly, dedicating the subsequent 2 hours to detailing, item by item, precisely why his professional record failed the evaluation. Gavin Newsom strode into room 216 of the Hart-Senate office building with his customary air, appearing as though the space was constructed solely for his entrance. He wore a charcoal suit costing $3,200, custom-fitted to a physique maintained with strict discipline by a man acutely aware that physical presentation is the initial page of an American political resume. His hair appeared flawless and his smile seemed carefully measured, sufficiently warm to imply approachability, yet sufficiently controlled to suggest authority. In his wake, a six-person communications contingent filled the second row. Two staff members on laptops, a videographer, a press secretary holding a phone in each hand, and two advisors dedicated solely to tracking the proceeding live and crafting social media replies within a minute and a half of any noteworthy moment. Newsom arrived in Washington ready for conflict, having released a new podcast episode titled Why California Works the previous week, while his team had already drafted 3 tweets and a post-hearing declaration, all emphasizing variations of the theme. The governor resists partisan assaults and upholds California's achievements. The proceeding was intended to be performative, an arena where Newsom excelled. He had mastered this art since his initial mayoral run in San Francisco, realizing the camera favors assurance over ability and that political confidence serves as a highly persuasive stand-in for competence. Opposite him on the dais, Ohio Senator JD Vance sat with only a solitary piece of paper, not a binder, nor a folder, nor a pile of texts. It was one standard letter-size sheet featuring a title Newsom could not decipher from his vantage point. Vance failed to look up upon Newsom's entrance, preoccupied with making a note in the margin with a fine-tipped pen, leaving a small red mark reminiscent of those made by instructors grading tests or managers reviewing job applications. As the hearing commenced, Vance finally looked up, offering no smile or standard performative etiquette typical for high-profile testifiers, omitting the "thank you for attending" that serves simultaneously as a greeting and a caution. Instead, he raised the document so the lenses could capture the title, Governor Gavin Newsom, Executive Summary for National Leadership. Vance began noting the governor's presidential aspirations were common knowledge, citing his podcast, This is Gavin Newsom, recent trips to key primary states like New Hampshire, South Carolina, and Iowa over the past half year, and his appearance at Davos as proof he was actively campaigning. Newsom attempted to interject regarding his purpose there, but Vance continued, clarifying that he wasn't attacking ambition itself, viewing it as acceptable, and believed the presidency ought to be accessible to any who feel qualified. He argued, however, that qualifications necessitate investigation, and he intended to treat Newsom as a serious contender should be treated as a job applicant. Tapping the document, he identified it as Newsom's resume, constructed from the governor's campaign site, public declarations, annual state addresses, and comments made at Davos. Vance announced his intention to review these stated accomplishments individually to determine if this professional record survived the evaluation process. Within 2 hours, a red annotation would accompany every line on that document. Newsom was destined to exit via the side door, bypassing the array of cameras where his media secretary had been waiting since well before the proceeding started. Furthermore, that solitary sheet of paper left inverted on the table by Vance would be captured by a nearby Reuters journalist. That image was set to accumulate 22 million views prior to the evening broadcast. Addressing the initial item, Vance quoted Newsom's Davos remarks claiming management of the globe's 5th largest economy, referring to California's roughly $4.1 trillion GDP. Acknowledging it as an imposing figure, Vance offered due credit before looking up to clarify that economic management involves overseeing operational systems, regulation, tax collection, funding distribution, payment processing, benefit issuance, and compliance enforcement. He shifted to examine the actual managerial record, noting that Dana Williamson, Newsom's chief of staff between 2022 and 2024, was indicted by federal prosecutors in November 2025 for allegedly routing campaign and pandemic relief funds to personal and associate accounts. Vance highlighted that two co-defendants had accepted plea agreements ostensibly confirming the scheme's reality, then paused intentionally for several seconds to let the implications resonate. He emphasized that this individual, handpicked to oversee Newsom's office schedule and legislative priorities, participating in high-level policy meetings impacting 39 million citizens, was charged with fraud less than a year after leaving her position. Vance stressed she was not an insignificant employee, but rather his top aide during his administration. He continued by pointing out that during Newsom's tenure, the Employment Development Department, responsible for unemployment claims, lost roughly $33 billion to fraudulent activity, a sum equal to Oregon's yearly budget. He cited an instance of criminal audacity where a Memphis rapper named Fontrell Baines publicly boasted in a music video about filing fraudulent claims while holding agency envelopes. In the song titled EDD, Baines rapped about filing claims instead of selling illicit substances, successfully obtaining over $700,000 via fraud before his apprehension. Furthermore, Vance referenced U.S. Department of Health and Human Services estimates, emphasizing they were federal figures, not his own, indicating California's Medi-Cal program sustained a fraud rate of approximately 25% since 2019, affecting 1 in 4 enrollees. He noted that with California's roughly 15 million enrollees, potential fraud exposure reaches tens of billions of dollars. He added that the state auditor designated 7 state agencies as high risk due to waste, fraud, or operational failures, 2 of which have remained on that list for 19 years since 2007. Vance pointed out that Newsom occupied statewide office for the majority of that time, yet not a single agency was removed from the list. Finally, he mentioned a 2025 legislative proposal intended not to lower, but to increase the felony threshold for welfare fraud from $950 to $25,000, thereby creating obstacles to prosecuting the very fraud already widespread throughout systems under his management. He then picked up his pen, made a distinct red notation beside the initial line of the resume, and declared that this record now accompanied his credentials. Newsom directed his comments toward the microphone, maintaining his composure as he was not easily flustered in such settings. Possessing extensive experience in public presentation long before Vance entered legal studies, he argued that California processes a volume of government transactions exceeding any other state, including the highest numbers of unemployment claims and Medi-Cal participants due to its status as the nation's most populous state. He contended that fraud represents a national challenge, asserting every state confronted EDD fraud during the pandemic, and insisting Dana Williamson's alleged actions were solely her own responsibility, noting he enforced accountability immediately upon the emergence of the allegations. His response was delivered with a smooth, practiced, and polished cadence, strategically employed when he intended to project both rationality and resolve. Vance immediately countered by checking the timeline against Newsom's claim of swift accountability regarding Williamson. He noted she served in administration until December 2024, while the federal indictment occurred in November 2025, meaning any accountability was applied retroactively and nearly a year after her employment ended. Vance characterized this as strategic timing rather than genuine accountability. Addressing Newsom's point about fraud being a national issue, Vance conceded its widespread nature during the pandemic, but presented comparisons. Texas lost roughly $8 billion, New York approximately $11 billion, and Florida about $5 billion. He argued that while California is the largest state, it is roughly 50% larger than Texas, not 3 times its size, making the $33 billion loss disproportionate to its population. Vance contended the massive fraud was proportional instead to flawed systems that processed claims without verification, distributed debit cards to inmates, and were sufficiently porous for a musical artist to boast about exploiting them on public platforms. He emphasized that fraudulent activity extended beyond the EDD, citing a Medi-Cal fraud rate near 25% and documented fraud totaling hundreds of millions in the CalFresh food assistance program. Vance reiterated that 7 state agencies remained high risk according to the auditor, with 2 on the list since 2007, preceding modern technological milestones in Newsom's first term. He argued they were flawed upon his arrival and remained so under his leadership. Regarding the legislative reaction, he criticized the proposal not to intensify anti-fraud efforts, but to increase the felony welfare fraud threshold from $950 to $25,000. He characterized this not as improvement, but as a capitulation, whereby the government attempts to redefine fraud it apparently cannot stop. Vance resumed by distinctively marking the initial line of the resume with his pen, a sound clearly captured by the audio equipment, and reiterated that this record was now permanently associated with the governor. He then angled the document marginally to focus on the subsequent line. His movements appeared calculated and unhurried, characteristic of someone who had thoroughly mastered the data, yet chose to verify it visually to enhance his authoritative presence. Addressing the second resume item, Vance quoted Newsom's Davos statements claiming national leadership regarding climate initiatives and the transition to clean energy. He noted Newsom cited the purchase of 2.5 million electric vehicles in California, positioning himself as a significant opposition to federal environmental policy. Vance shifted to verify this against actions, pointing out that in July 2025, just 6 months following Davos, Newsom reversed his energy strategies by endorsing increased in-state petroleum production. Furthermore, he noted Newsom abandoned a proposed ceiling on oil industry profits. Vance inquired as to why this reversal occurred, suggesting it was due to refineries shutting down under regulatory stress created by his policies, combined with gasoline prices soaring to $6 per gallon. He argued that Newsom's constituents, specifically those unable to afford electric vehicles, driving older models between multiple jobs, were forced to choose between refueling their vehicles and feeding their families. Vance continued by noting California's electricity costs reached 32 cents per kilowatt hour compared to the national average of 17 cents, forcing residents to pay nearly twice the normal amount. Additionally, he highlighted that the 2.5 million electric vehicles mentioned at Davos must rely on an electrical grid that the state's own utilities publicly acknowledged cannot satisfy maximum demand. He referenced an August 2025 Flex Alert issued by the California Independent System Operator requesting residents to lower electricity consumption between 4 and 9 to prevent outages. Vance summarized this as simultaneously promoting electric vehicle ownership while rationing the power necessary to utilize them. He then turned to Newsom's major infrastructure initiative, the Rapid Transit Project, advertised as a corridor linking San Francisco and Los Angeles intended to revolutionize Californian transport. He highlighted that the present cost is estimated at $135 billion, a vast increase over the original $33 billion projection. He noted the project lags decades behind schedule, with the segment currently under construction merely linking Merced to Bakersfield. Offering due respect to those specific areas, he emphasized that this does not constitute the transformational route voters approved in 2008. He referenced a humorous yet accurate critique from a satirical news broadcast describing it as the advanced high-speed train destined to move people from Merced to Bakersfield. Vance also noted that Newsom claimed in 2020 that CAL FIRE managed 90,000 acres via fuel breaks and controlled burns to mitigate wildfire danger. He countered this with verified state records indicating the actual figure was only 11,099 acres, meaning the governor overstated the total by 690%. Vance argued that such a massive discrepancy of nearly 700% is far too large to be considered a minor calculation error or simple misunderstanding. He suggested that if a student presented such inaccurate figures on a test, they would fail, and if a corporate leader included such overstatements in a financial report, they would face investigation by regulatory authorities. He criticized Newsom for including this 690% exaggeration in a press statement concerning public safety and property protection from fire without enforcing accountability for the inaccuracy. He then referred to the inevitable outcome when the January 2025 Los Angeles wildfires occurred, leading to destruction, deaths, and massive displacement of families. Vance noted immediate broad political criticism targeting insufficient water infrastructure, lacking fire preparedness and prolonged neglected maintenance regarding preventative systems. He pointed out that Newsom attributed these events to climate change. While Vance acknowledged climate change as a reality, he firmly stated that environmental shifts did not decide to fabricate fuel break acreage by 60 or 90%, nor did they neglect infrastructure funding. He asserted that a government committed these errors, specifically Newsom's government. Vance shifted focus to the high-speed rail, noting it is cited more frequently than any other project as proof of the governor's infrastructure foresight. He detailed the specific figures, highlighting the jump from the original $33 billion voter-approved estimate to the current $135 billion projection, marking a 309% increase. Furthermore, he emphasized the departure from the original 2020 completion timeline, noting there is now no guaranteed finishing date, with the active construction segment merely connecting Merced to Bakersfield. He reiterated, with respect to the residents of those cities, that this does not represent the transformational San Francisco to Los Angeles Link California voters authorized in 2008. He referenced satirical news commentary accurately portraying it as a high-speed link exclusively between Merced and Bakersfield. Vance argued that when comedy programs offer more precise descriptions of a major infrastructure project than official government communications, it indicates a severe operational problem. He contrasted this with Newsom's Davos comments boasting about 2.5 million electric vehicles sold in California as proof of environmental leadership. Vance reiterated that these millions of vehicles charge on an electrical network that state regulators have warned cannot satisfy maximum requirements. He referenced the August 2025 Flex Alert requesting usage reductions during peak evening hours to prevent widespread blackouts. Vance summarized this as a contradiction rather than a successful transition, promoting electric vehicles while rationing the necessary power. He marked the resume distinctively with his pen, indicating the data now permanently accompanied his credentials. Vance shifted to housing, reminding the governor of his 2018 campaign vow to construct 3.5 million new residences by 2025. He emphasized this pledge was fundamental to his campaign, featured prominently on his website and in advertisements, and served as the specific target shared with voters concerned about the housing affordability crisis. Vance then stated the actual outcome: only 640,000 homes were built. He paused intentionally, allowing that specific number to permeate the chamber alone. He noted that when questioned about the discrepancy of nearly 3 million missing homes, Newsom recharacterized his original pledge as an aspirational goal. Vance argued that an aspirational goal is suitable for physical education targets, not for governmental promises impacting housing for 39 million citizens. He contended that Newsom failed to meet a promise, neglecting to deliver 82% of it, and subsequently altered the terminology to make the failure appear intentional. Vance characterized this not as a communications approach, but as the terminology of an individual who suspects they will face zero accountability for their public statements. Regarding homelessness, he pointed out that Newsom's administration dedicated $37 billion to the issue over the preceding 6 years, yet California's homelessness population increased by 31.6% during that time frame. He noted California contains 12% of the country's population, but 1/3 of its homeless population. Vance argued that Newsom spent more per homeless individual than any governor in American history, only for the problem to intensify. He criticized the housing-first strategy guiding that $37 billion expenditure, noting it specifically bans funding for initiatives requiring sobriety or mental health treatment as prerequisites for housing. Vance contended this resulted in funding programs fundamentally incapable of addressing the primary drivers of chronic homelessness, addiction, and untreated mental health issues. He argued that Newsom designed a strategy engineered for failures regarding its intended purpose, despite spending $37 billion on it. He referenced Newsom's August 2024 televised visit to a homeless encampment in Los Angeles where he cleared the area without notifying city officials, characterizing it as impactful television that altered absolutely nothing. Vance insisted that clearing an encampment constitutes a media event, not effective housing strategy. Newsom's response marked his strongest segment during the proceeding, utilizing a tone of measured irritation in defense of a record he felt was significantly misrepresented by individuals without experience governing anything larger than a legislative office. Newsom retorted that homelessness is a nationwide problem fueled by decades of decreased federal funding for public housing, the closure of mental health institutions beginning in the Reagan era, a flawed real estate market predating his tenure, and an opioid crisis impacting every state. He asserted he dedicated more resources toward combating homelessness than any governor in the history of the country, exceeding any state in any time frame. He criticized alternative examples like Florida and Texas, arguing they do not resolve the issue but merely criminalize it by arresting people for sleeping on public walkways or relocating them across cities. Newsom characterized that approach as brutality involving badges and travel tickets. The argument was forceful, presenting a legitimate structural defense with substantive criticism of alternative methods, causing several attendees in the gallery to nod in Newsom's direction. Vance paused, utilizing his customary deliberate patience characteristic of an auditor, allowing the silence to make the defense appear exactly like an explanation deflecting blame for failure onto others. Vance then shifted to compare the results of the Florida approach, which Newsom labeled as brutal, against Newsom's own strategies, which he termed compassionate. Vance cited data indicating that homelessness decreased under Florida's model, while it increased in California under Newsom's. He emphasized that both strategies produced concrete outcomes, but Florida's resulted in improved figures while Newsom's merely generated high spending. Addressing Newsom's claim of spending more money than any governor in history, Vance conceded its accuracy but highlighted that despite the $37 billion expenditure, homelessness intensified by 31.6%. He argued that in every other field, including business, medicine, or engineering, spending the highest amount only to see the problem worsen would be viewed as a failure, not a credential. Vance firmly stated that the $37 billion figure does not serve as a defense, but rather as an indictment against him. He concluded by asserting that such extensive waste is precisely what the nation cannot tolerate from a president, and distinctively annotated the first line of the resume. Vance directed attention toward the fourth item on the resume, highlighting Newsom's prominent national claim of resisting the Trump administration and upholding democratic values. He chose to ignore the validity of the claim itself to instead scrutinize his specific positions regarding Israel, listed chronologically on the document. Vance noted that in September 2025, Newsom expressed profound respect for Israel to journalists, yet by October 2025, he separated himself from AIPAC, labeling it irrelevant to his daily activities. Furthermore, he referenced Newsom's February 2026 assertion that he would never accept contributions from AIPAC, despite nonpartisan records published immediately afterward confirming he was in fact a former donor. Vance continued the timeline, noting Newsom characterized Israel as an apartheid state in March 2026, before reversing position later that same week by claiming he was describing a hypothetical future trajectory rather than its current status. Vance argued that this series of conflicting stances within half a year, ranging from profound respect to denial of a proven donor relationship to accusations of apartheid followed by a retraction, demonstrated a lack of direction. He contended Newsom's positions on Israel move in circles rather than evolving, with each adjustment matching a shift in target audiences among Californian progressives, national Jewish donors, or primary voters and activists in New Hampshire and South Carolina. Vance firmly stated that the governor's positions appear to track itinerary changes rather than fundamental principles. He added that this pattern extends beyond Israel, surfacing throughout his entire political history, citing his stance on energy. Vance noted Newsom campaigned as an anti-fossil fuel executive, issuing 6 years of executive mandates, exerting regulatory pressure, and conducting press events centered on clean energy. He argued that in July 2025, when refineries commenced shutdowns and fuel prices hit $6 per gallon, Newsom shifted position to endorse in-state petroleum production and abandon threatened profit caps on the oil industry. Newsom explained this shift as adapting to fluctuating circumstances, But Vance countered that while weather adapts to circumstances, leaders must hold enduring positions. He moved to discuss economic policy, specifically the governor's signature $20 per hour minimum wage signature for fast food employees, noting a specific exemption for restaurants baking and selling bread as a single menu item was buried in the legislation. Vance highlighted that Greg Flynn, California's largest Panera Bread franchise holder, donated over $100,000 to Newsom's campaigns. He noted that when journalists discovered the connection between the exemption and the donor relationship, the governor's office initially issued a denial, followed by an acknowledgement that the exemption existed, and finally asserted it was unrelated to the donor. Vance summarized this as a three-stage reaction: deny, acknowledge, and redefine, a pattern he argued Newsom utilized regarding Israel, energy, and any challenging fact. He then addressed immigration policy, noting Newsom positioned himself as the leading advocate for sanctuary state status nationally through legislation, speeches, and federal lawsuits. Vance pointed out that in September 2025, when Assembly Bill 1840, intended to broaden state housing support to undocumented immigrants, reached his desk, he vetoed it. Vance argued this veto directly contradicted the values Newsom had championed for 6 years, contending it was driven by 2028 polling data showing that generosity toward immigration was a liability in key swing states, making the principle expendable when strategic goals demanded it. He stated that the governor's professional record does not demonstrate uniformity, but rather shows a man adopting every position at the opportune moment and discarding it when inconvenient. Vance utilized a meteorological metaphor, characterizing this behavior as the equivalent of weather that shifts direction based on external conditions without inherent convictions or agency. He summarized this pattern not as a unique political phenomenon, but simply as administrative weather, distinctively marking the resume. The chamber had physically transformed as the audience realized collectively that they were witnessing a truly memorable event. At the proceedings start concerning the fraud details, the attendees appeared attentive yet doubtful, typical of an audience viewing a political opponent's attack on a governor. The doubt vanished during the energy section, replaced by fixed attention as listeners tracked a logical sequence to its conclusion. During the housing discussion, that attention intensified into palpable discomfort, typical when observing a record being systematically deconstructed by its own underlying data and the governor's own contradictory statements regarding promises and delivery. As Vance transitioned to the final fifth segment of the resume, the room fell into a specific silence characteristic of a setting where everyone understands the conclusion yet desires to hear it vocalized regardless. Newsom's 6-person communications contingent in the second row ceased their typing, with several staff members looking silently at their phones, a third looking toward the floor, and the videographer lowering his equipment. Vance elevated the professional record, holding it in one hand so that the column of precise red notations running down the left margin was clearly visible from the spectator gallery, resembling grades on a poorly performed examination. Vance then reviewed the 4 failures documented by the governor's own figures measured against his original claims, starting with the first item: management of the world's 5th largest economy. Vance reiterated that Newsom's chief of staff faced fraud charges, his unemployment bureau lost $33 billion, his healthcare system endured estimated 25% fraud levels, and 7 state agencies remained classified as high risk, leading to an estimated total fraud exposure of $180 billion during his leadership. Moving to the second item regarding climate and energy preeminence, Vance reminded him of his policy reversal when fuel became unaffordable, state electricity expenses doubling national averages, and his signature rapid transit project costing $135 billion, while merely connecting cities omitted from the original plan. He added that Newsom overstated fire prevention efforts by 690% regarding the third item of housing development and combating homelessness. Vance emphasized that Newsom pledged 3.5 million residences but built only 640,000, while spending $37 billion as homelessness increased by 31.6%, subsequently relabeling the massive housing shortfall as an aspirational target. For the fourth item, resisting Trump and upholding democratic ideals, Vance recounted 5 shifts in position regarding Israel over 6 months, exempting a major campaign donor from a minimum wage mandate applicable to all others, and vetoing an immigration measure aligned with his campaigned values. Vance set the document down, identifying it as Newsom's actual resume representing the accomplishments presented as qualifications for the presidency. He posed a final question demanding an answer suitable for every American voter across all political affiliations. If he proved incapable of successfully managing 39 million citizens, if massive fraud occurred under his administration, if homelessness intensified under his programs, if housing failed to materialize, and if concrete promises were converted into aspirational targets, Vance challenged why 330 million people should entrust him with the nation. The room was engulfed in silence, the specific quietness accompanying an inquiry lacking a positive reply. This outcome occurred not due to the witness being inarticulate, but because the question was derived directly from the witness's own record, which possessed zero rebuttal, only defensive explanations suitable for an interview but not actual answers. Newsom positioned himself toward the microphone and instantly utilized the rhetorical shift that had sustained his career through interviews, debates, and press conferences for the past 7 years. Newsom argued that he was the leader who confronted the administration and defended Californian values against federal deconstruction efforts, suggesting that statistics could be selectively chosen and asserting that California residents understood his record. Vance responded in a low, quiet tone, a quietness resembling the sound of a door closing with finality. He specified that his inquiry concerned Newsom's personal record, not federal administration or Washington actions, pointing out that Vance had only referenced the numbers listed on the provided document. He emphasized to the public viewing the proceedings that throughout the past 2 hours, Newsom consistently countered questions about verified fraud, homelessness, housing failures, and policy reversals by discussing Donald Trump. Vance stated that Trump's record did not appear on the governor's resume, only Newsom's own results were present, accusing him of using the entire hearing to evade confronting them. He inverted the professional record on the table between them, rendering the red notations invisible and leaving only an unremarkable white rectangle on the wood surface, resembling generic documentation destined for disposal after an evaluation. Vance concluded by informing the governor that he believed the evaluation had ended. Newsom stood and buttoned his jacket, utilizing the automatic physical memory common to figures accustomed to rising from numerous witness chairs and debate podiums. However, he did not proceed toward the camera array, nor did he pause to provide the post-hearing commentary his team had prepared for the media. Instead, he angled to his left, murmured an inaudible statement to a staff member away from the microphones, and exited via the side door. His press secretary, positioned near the camera area with phone in hand and a pre-written tweet since before the proceedings' commencement, silently observed his departure before locking her device. The prepared social media post claiming the governor defended California's record against partisan assaults would never be dispatched, having been authored for a hearing that unfolded differently than this one. Vance remained seated for several minutes, engaging briefly with a colleague, making a note on a separate pad, and then arose to exit through the main doorway. He refrained from speaking to journalists or offering a victory declaration, walking to the elevator with hands in his pockets while the single clean, unmarked copy of the paper was folded inside his jacket. The annotated copy remained resting on the table as a Reuters photographer passing through the chamber while staff cleared the chairs noticed the document. Picking it up and observing the red notations, she immediately realized the value of the item and photographed it exactly as it lay, capturing the white paper, red ink, and underlying wood grain. The image was dispatched to the Reuters wire at 4:47 p.m. By 6:00 p.m., it had accumulated 22 million views. By midnight, it ranked as the most shared image from any congressional hearing in 2026. The visual of the resume transformed into the definitive artifact of the entire story, much like symbolic items linked to famous past political confrontations, though this resume operated differently. While items like pencils or gavels function as mere symbols or instruments, a resume serves as documentation susceptible to reading, sharing, annotation, and verification against physical reality. The image invited viewers to verify the claims against the red markings, and the viewers discovered the claims were accurate. The phrase confirming an item now accompanied his credentials became a widely recognized internet joke format within 48 hours, structuring political claims followed by contradictory evidence below, applied to various leaders whose public claims exceeded their documented results. The format's simplicity, replicability, and devastating effectiveness stemmed from requiring only a claim and a verified fact rather than subjective opinion. The video snippet featuring Vance reciting Newsom's own words regarding aspirational goals spread independently and reached an even wider audience. The clip was shared by diverse accounts because the humor regarding a leader promising millions of homes, delivering a fraction, and relabeling the gap as aspirational required zero external commentary to achieve impact. The concluding video clip, however, was the one that fundamentally altered the political trajectory. Every viewer could verify for themselves Vance's final devastating observation that every question regarding Newsom's record was countered by discussing Trump, having witnessed the same pivots throughout the 2-hour proceeding. The observation, once vocalized, could not be ignored as it accurately described events occurring in plain view. Gretchen Whitmer issued a concise 5-word statement noting the governor could speak for himself. Within political communication, refusing to defend a targeted colleague constitutes the initial step in seeking to replace them. The statement conveyed everything by omitting supporting rhetoric, challenging Vance's data, or offering solidarity typical when damage is manageable. The implication of Whitmer's brief statement was that the damage was not manageable. Josh Shapiro, the Pennsylvania governor and other prominent contender for 2028, said nothing at all regarding the matter, with his office declining comment. A senior Shapiro advisor speaking anonymously to Politico offered a strategic 7-word assessment asserting they would avoid touching the comprehensive damage that spoke for itself. Intervening would connect them with the wreckage, making the best strategy to allow the situation to cool before proceeding. Pete Buttigieg, when inquired on a Sunday morning broadcast regarding fair treatment, produced a statement carefully engineered in a communication seminar style to avoid both defense and criticism, describing policy debates as a healthy part of the democratic process. The sentence avoided commitment, criticism, or support, normalizing the proceeding as a healthy debate without endorsing its specific conclusions. DNC megadonors conducted a temperature check conversation lasting 45 minutes with Axios reporting major participants, with the overall consensus described as cold. Participants utilized terminology suggesting delay, reassessment of the timeline, or referencing alternatives like Whitmer without requiring context. Not a single donor utilized the word support concerning Newsom, with the absence of this term after a major public event signaling a credit downgrade that moves the investment from growth portfolios to a watch list. The House Oversight Committee, conducting a parallel probe informally titled Empire of Fraud, intensified its document requests. Within a week, Chairman Comer issued subpoenas to the California Employment Development Department for comprehensive records regarding pandemic fraud detection processes. The immediate shift from request to subpoena directly resulted from the hearing, as Vance's public presentation of fraud figures generated political momentum that routine work could not achieve, forcing the public expectation for answers now facilitated by subpoenas. The California State Auditor's Office found itself handling a massive volume of media inquiries typically associated with active scandals rather than annual reports. The high-risk classification of 7 agencies, public data for months, was suddenly reported as critical breaking news. The underlying data remained unchanged, only the audience had altered. The California Legislative Analyst's Office published a report detailing high-speed rail delays and immense cost overruns. Though the report was pre-existing and had its own timeline, every political journalist covering the 2028 race noted the timing of its release 2 weeks after the hearing. In Sacramento, timing is considered non-accidental, serving as the most sophisticated commentary method available to nonpartisan institutions. Newsom's 2028 operational structure, including his media strategy, early state visits, donor cultivation, and international positioning, did not immediately collapse. Political structures founded on long-term investment and substantial funding do not disintegrate from a single hearing. However, they developed a critical timeline problem, that political strategists recognize instantaneously and that rebranding or strategic adjustments cannot fix. A timeline problem occurs when a candidate's forward movement stops while the operational calendar advances. Donors set to commit funds decide to wait, staff members delay joining, and polling strength shifts to uncertainty, collectively constituting a slow leak in a political tire that becomes catastrophic upon attempting a full stop. A Newsom advisor speaking anonymously for a profile piece detailing the governor's ambitions facing new calculations candidly described their condition, likely regretting the statement regarding their transition from momentum pre-hearing to a compounding timeline problem post-hearing. The media centerpiece, This is Gavin Newsom, sustained an 18% decline in ratings in the subsequent 2 weeks. The irony was severe as the podcast existed to highlight communication skills, yet the hearing proved that such skills lacking a defensible record represented a liability rather than an asset. Increased performance on the podcast served merely as a reminder that performance was his only remaining strength. At a Sacramento healthcare event 3 weeks following the hearing, a reporter routinely asked about homelessness spending, a query he had fluently answered hundreds of times with polished references to historic investment and fighting for the future. He commenced with his usual narrative approach but stopped abruptly mid-sentence. The resulting 2-second silence stood as a significant void during a podium address with active cameras, long enough for every reporter present to note a distinct shift in his delivery. He restarted with more care, omitting the usual gloss for greater precision by citing the specific $37 billion figure before mentioning its intent. He acknowledged the homelessness increase before discussing structural causes, leading with the concrete result before offering the explanation. This marked the first instance in 7 years as governor that Gavin Newsom prioritized numbers over narrative in a public response, reversing the order from every previous answer he had ever given on the topic. The reversal was subtle enough that only one long-term staffer present noticed, observing her boss do something she had advocated for years. Simultaneously, on his desk in the governor's office in Sacramento, featuring floor-to-ceiling windows viewing Capitol Park, rested a new document. This was not the resume Vance had annotated, which now resided in media archives and permanent Senate records, but a new document prepared request by policy staff delivered in a manila envelope. The heading read, Revised Executive Summary, Governor Gavin Newsom. It appeared shorter than the original, utilizing different terminology. Where the original claimed he led, the revision stated he oversaw, and where it claimed he transformed, the revision noted he initiated. The promises were reduced, numbers were prioritized, and achievements were detailed regarding specific outcomes rather than general intentions. Though not necessarily a better document, it represented a more honest reflection of his record. The document had undergone 3 revisions, featuring marginal notes in blue ink, perhaps unconsciously chosen to distinguish them from the red marks another pen had made in another room on another resume 3 weeks prior. No one outside the immediate office knew of its existence, as it was intended solely for internal consumption by the man who would read it late at night alone. He would use it to measure the gap between his promises and deliveries, deciding if the distance was temporary or permanent. A resume summarizes accomplishments but inevitably summarizes unkept promises, unmet goals, and unreconciled statistics as well. And unlike corporate employers, voters never cease checking references.